There is a particular kind of silence that lives inside a house after someone has been gone long enough. Not the silence of an empty afternoon or the quiet that follows a good meal. This is the silence that has settled into the walls themselves, that has learned the schedule of the rooms, that knows which floorboards creak and at what hour the refrigerator hums loudest. Marvel Fairweather had been living inside that silence for 4 years, and she had made a kind of peace with it. Not happiness exactly, something more durable than happiness. The practiced equilibrium of a woman who had decided without fanfare to keep going. She was 68 years old. She had worked in travel for 34 years, most of them at a firm in Savannah that handled corporate accounts for companies up and down the eastern seaboard. She had booked first-class cabins and presidential suites and private transfers, or for executives who never once learned her last name. She had navigated airline strikes, volcanic ash clouds, embassy closures, and in the particular panic of a CEO who had left his passport in a hotel room in Brussels. She had done all of this with a precision that her colleagues called unnerving and her clients called invaluable, and she had done it long enough that the skills had stopped feeling like skills and had become simply the way she moved through the world. She read details the way other people read faces. She noticed what was out of place before she could articulate why. Her husband Bogart had called it her superpower. He said it with admiration and sometimes with a weariness that was also admiration because it meant she noticed everything he tried to hide too. He had been gone 4 years now, and she still set 2 coffee cups on the counter every morning before catching herself. The story does not begin in the airport lounge, though that is where the thing that changed everything first became visible. It begins, as most important things do, with an act of ordinary kindness. Her neighbor Mamie was 74 years old and had never in her adult life traveled alone. Her daughter had flown in to accompany her to Portland to meet the first great-grandchild, but a burst pipe in a flooded kitchen had kept the daughter home, and Mamie had been left to manage Hartsfield-Jackson Atlanta International Airport by herself. She had called Marvell at 7:30 in the morning, voice threaded tight with anxiety she was too proud to fully name. "I just need someone to walk me to the gate," she said, which both of them understood to mean considerably more than that. Most people called her Marv. The name Marvell had been her grandmother's, a woman born in 1901 who had lived long enough to see a granddaughter go to work in a glass office tower downtown, and Marv had kept it out of love rather than vanity. She had driven Mamie to the airport. It was a Tuesday in October, the Georgia sky the color of old pewter, the air carrying the first genuine chill of the season. She parked in the short-term garage, walked Mamie through, ticketing, stood beside her in the security line, and watched while the old woman gathered her shoes and her cardigan and her small rolling suitcase on the other side of the scanner with the focused determination of someone defusing a bomb. Marv waited until Mamie's small, stooped figure had fully disappeared into the crowd before she turned around. She was in no hurry. That was the thing about retirement, that she still had not entirely made her peace with even after 3 years of it. The absence of urgency. The days that opened in front of her like empty rooms furnished but waiting. She walked back through the terminal, slowly letting the flow of travelers move around her, and she thought about nothing in particular, which was itself a kind of luxury she had not yet learned to receive without suspicion. It was the sign for the Meridian Club lounge that stopped her. She had not used her lounge access in years. The business accounts that still technically afforded her the membership had been sitting dormant like a subscription she kept meaning to cancel but never quite got around to. On an impulse she did not examine, she took the escalator up. The lounge was the particular kind of elegant that airports achieve when they are trying very hard, which is to say it was comfortable without being warm and quiet, without being peaceful. A wall of floor-to-ceiling glass looked out over the tarmac. Planes moved in the middle distance with the slow gravity of very large things. The air smelled of recycled coolness and something vanilla adjacent being pumped through the vents. The young woman at the concierge desk had close-cropped natural hair and the bearing of someone who had been taught to make everything look effortless. Her name badge said Rochelle. She looked up when Marv approached and offered a smile that was professionally warm, which Marv recognized because she had worn the same smile herself for 3 decades. Marv placed her old membership card on the granite counter. Rochelle took it, glanced at it, then looked at her screen. Something shifted in her expression. It was small, the kind of shift that happens in a face when the mind is running a calculation it does not want to show. She looked at the card again. then at the screen. Then she began to type, and her typing had the slightly deliberate quality of someone choosing each keystroke. Marv had 34 years of reading exactly this kind of moment. "Is there a problem with the card?" she asked, her voice easy, her eyes steady. "One moment, Mrs. Fairweather," Rochelle said. Another beat of typing. Then instead of simply turning the monitor, she reached for a sheet of paper from a small printer beneath the desk, and she placed it on the counter with both hands, the way you place something you believe the other person needs to be able to hold. Marv looked down. Her full name was at the top, Marvel Octavia Fairweather. Below it, in the clean, organized columns of a professional travel itinerary, were 17 separate confirmations. Not a flight and a hotel. Not a package deal with a reasonable price. First-class airfare to Cancun, Mexico on a flight that had departed that morning. A private transfer from the Cancun airport. The presidential suite at the Mariposa Grand Resort in the Riviera Maya for 10 nights. A couple's massage package. A private yacht excursion. A chef's tasting menu with wine pairings for two booked for 3 separate evenings. A spa credit. A sunset photography session. A deep-sea fishing charter. At the bottom of the page, in a font that seemed almost apologetic, given what it was saying, was the total: $52,400. Marv set her hand flat on the counter to steady herself. She looked at her hand, and it seemed to belong to someone she did not know well. Pale and distant, the knuckles too prominent. The sound of the refrigerator unit behind the bar seemed to grow louder until it was the only sound in the room. "Is everything all right, Mrs. Fairweather?" Rochelle asked. Her voice had changed. The professional warmth was still there, but underneath it was something more genuine and more careful. She was watching Marv the way a person watches someone they are not sure is going to stay upright. Marv breathed. The air felt thin, like high altitude. "Everything is surprising," she said, which was exactly true. "I believe there has been some kind of misunderstanding. I need a few minutes." She folded the paper in half, then in half again, the creases deliberate and sharp. She picked it up and carried it to an armchair in a far corner of the lounge and sat down. For a long time, she simply looked out through the glass wall at the planes. Each one a sealed container of people going somewhere, each person with a story and a destination and a reason they believed was sufficient. She had spent her career charting those paths. It seemed she had lost track of the one closest to her. She did not call her daughter. She had learned over 68 years of living that speaking before you know what you are going to say is a luxury no one can truly afford. The thing to do first was understand, and to understand, she needed to go home. But before she stood up, she became aware that Rochelle had crossed the lounge and was standing a few feet away, clearly uncertain whether to approach. Marv looked at her. "I'm sorry to interrupt," Rochelle said quietly, "but I thought you should know. This morning before you came in, there was a phone call to the lounge. The caller asked whether anyone had checked your reservations yet, whether anyone had been in under your name." Marv kept her face still. "Man or woman?" "Woman, young." Rochelle hesitated. "I told her no. I don't know why I did exactly. It just felt like the right answer." Marv studied her for a moment. A young woman in a profession that rewarded discretion, who had made a judgment call based on instinct, and who was now standing in front of a stranger taking the risk that the instinct had been correct. "You were right," Marv said. "Thank you." Rochelle nodded once and returned to her desk without another word. Marv sat with that for a moment. A phone call made that morning to find out whether Marv had looked. Someone checking to see if the trap had been discovered. The architecture of that fact settled into her chest like a stone into still water. She stood up, tucked the folded itinerary into her bag, and walked toward the door. Rochelle looked up as she passed. "Mrs. Fairweather, do you need me to call anyone?" Marv paused without turning around. "Not yet," she said, and the word yet carried the weight of everything she had not yet decided. She drove home to Savannah in a state that was not grief and was not rage, and was not the sharp-edged clarity of crisis. It was something slower and more corrosive, the feeling of watching a familiar landscape reconfigure itself into something unrecognizable. The oak-lined streets, the pastel shotgun houses, the heavy green air that smelled of gardenias. All of it appeared to her now as belonging to a different version of the morning, one in which her daughter still simply loved her. The grandfather clock in the hallway chimed 3 when she walked through the front door. She stood in the foyer for a moment looking at the door to her home office. She had not used it for much more than bill paying since she retired. The big desktop computer sat in there sleeping a dark mirror in the corner of a room that smelled faintly of old paper and the cedar oil she used on the bookshelves. She went in and sat down and touched the power button. While the machine woke up, she thought about the last time her daughter Eugenia had come to visit. 3 weeks ago, a Tuesday as it happened, which made the symmetry feel deliberate, though she knew it was not. Her daughter had driven down from Atlanta in her red BMW, wearing the kind of fitted athletic clothes that cost more than Marv's first month of rent had cost in 1979, and had moved through the house with the focused energy of someone conducting a wellness inspection. She had checked the pantry for what she called inflammatory oils. She had suggested again that Marv replace the cast iron skillet with something ceramic coated and less problematic. She had opened the refrigerator, assessed its contents with a slight compression of her lips, and closed it without comment. They had sat in the living room with iced tea, and Eugenia had announced the trip. Her anniversary trip, the Riviera Maya, super exclusive, she had said, in the way people describe things that cost money to people they assume cannot afford them. One of those all-inclusive places, really just for couples, all romance packages and things. She had looked up then with eyes that were wild and earnest, a look Marv had seen her deploy since the age of 5, when she had explained with those same wide eyes who had knocked the porcelain bird off the mantelpiece. "I wish we could take you, Mama, but it would just be awkward." And Marv had said with complete sincerity, "Don't be silly. I wouldn't dream of intruding. You and Ambrose deserve your time." And she had meant it. She had meant every word. But now, sitting in her dim office, waiting for the computer to finish loading, Marv replayed a different moment from that visit. Toward the end of the afternoon, while Marv was in the kitchen, refilling their glasses, she had heard Eugenia on her phone in the next room. A brief exchange conducted in a lowered voice, only one side of it audible. Eugenia saying with a lightness that was the studied lightness of someone choosing their tone, "Mama won't notice. She barely opens her laptop anymore." Then a laugh, small and private. Then the conversation had dropped to a murmur Marv could not make out. She had thought nothing of it at the time. She had assumed it was Ambrose, and she had assumed it was about something logistical. A dinner reservation, perhaps. A gift she was not supposed to know about. Now the memory sat differently. The computer finished loading. The screen glowed blue in the afternoon dimness. Marv took a breath and typed the address she had not typed in 3 years, the IAT, agent portal, the professional system she had used every working day for 3 decades and had simply never gotten around to closing down. Her login credentials were saved in the browser. She clicked the button. The dashboard opened. 17 active reservations under Marvello Fairweather, all booked within the previous 30 days. All charged to the corporate American Express card that was still linked to her agent profile, the high-limit card she had needed for booking group travel for entire corporations, the card she had kept meaning to cancel and had not. She clicked on the first confirmation. Presidential Suite Mariposa Grand. She read through it with the systematic attention of someone who had been trained never to skim a confirmation. Non-refundable. Paid in full. Booked at agent-exclusive rates, which explained the slight discount on the otherwise astronomical total. She scrolled through the amenities with the efficiency of muscle memory, private plunge pool, 24-hour butler service, complimentary champagne upon arrival, until her eye landed on a line at the very bottom of the page. A small string of numbers and letters that most people would scroll past without recognizing. The IP address of the device that had made the booking. Marv had spent 34 years reading confirmation records the way forensic accountants read ledgers. She knew the prefixes used by major internet service providers in different regions. She knew what a residential Comcast address from the Atlanta metropolitan area looked like because she had seen it on countless corporate travel approvals submitted by clients based there. The prefix on this address was the one used by Comcast in the Buckhead neighborhood, the upscale neighborhood on the north side of Atlanta, where her daughter and son-in-law owned a 4-bedroom house that had cost more than most people earned in a decade. That single line of numbers told her everything she needed to know, and everything she had hoped not to know. It was not a hack. It was not a theft by a stranger. It was a fingerprint, and it belonged to her daughter. Marv leaned back in her chair. The old leather creaked once and then was quiet. She looked at the glowing screen for a long time without moving. It was not the discovery of the debt that sat most heavily. It was the specific geometry of the betrayal that stunned her. Her daughter had sat across from her in this house, in the room down the hall with iced tea and a fabricated story about resort policies and romantic exclusivity, had looked at her with those manufactured wide eyes and had told her she would be awkward on a trip that had been built using her own name, her own credit, her own professional identity, the very tools Marv had spent a lifetime building. A memory surfaced unbidden and sharp. Bogard sitting at the same desk years ago, handling a fraud case that a client had brought to the firm. He had said with the matter-of-fact gravity that was his way of saying something important, "Marv, don't let the emotion arrive before the facts. If the evidence is clear, the evidence does the talking, not hope." She had applied that principle to dozens of corporate fraud cases over the years. She had given that same counsel to junior colleagues. She had never imagined she would need it for this. She noticed with the professional part of her mind that never fully stopped working that all 17 reservations had been booked through a single wholesaler, Drummond Luxury Travel Group based in Montreal, an elegant, well-regarded company whose principal Stratton Drummond she had dealt with years ago through industry associations. His firm was known for meticulous record-keeping and senior agents who took detailed notes on every client interaction. One wholesaler, one set of logs, one point of contact who could tell her everything that had happened after the initial booking was made. She picked up the phone. She did not call Eugenia. She did not call Ambrose. She did not call the bank or the police. She called her son. DeWitt Fairweather Jr. was 42 years old, a corporate attorney in Charlotte, and the first of her two children with a deep attachment to the belief that his family was fundamentally decent. He answered on the third ring with the distracted brevity of a man between meetings. "Mama, hey, everything okay? I need to ask you something," she said, "and I need you to answer me straight." A brief pause, the kind that meant he was adjusting his attention. "Of course. What's going on? Has Eugenia talked to you recently about my professional accounts? About whether my old travel credentials were still active?" The silence on the other end was longer than it should have been. I mean, he started, and the hesitation in those two words told her everything before the rest of the sentence did. "She called maybe 2 months ago, asked me about dormant corporate accounts, whether you'd need help closing them out. I said you probably hadn't touched them in years." His voice had taken on a careful quality. "Why, what happened?" Marv told him. She kept it brief the same way she kept everything brief when precision mattered more than completeness. The itinerary, the IP address, the $52,000 charged to her corporate card, Eugenia's flight which had departed that morning. "Mama," DeWitt's voice had dropped. "That can't be right. There has to be a mistake." "There is no mistake, DeWitt. I'm looking at the booking records right now. The IP address is Buckhead Comcast. It's her. Let me call her. Let me just call her and find out what's happening before we do anything." "You will not call her." Marv said it without heat, which was more effective than saying it with heat would have been. "If you call her, she has time to prepare. She has time to create a story. We need the record as it is." "Mama, you're treating this like a criminal investigation. This is our family." "DeWitt." She let his name sit there for a moment. "She used my IATA number. She used my corporate credit card. She booked $52,000 of travel under my professional credentials without my knowledge or consent. And she sat in my living room 3 weeks ago and told me the trip was a couples-only resort so I would not feel left out. That is not a misunderstanding. That is a plan." The silence stretched. She could hear him breathing the slow, deliberate way he breathed when he was trying to recalibrate. "I'm sorry," he said finally. "I'm sorry I told her about the accounts. I didn't understand why she was asking." "You couldn't have known. Go back to your work. I'll handle this." She ended the call and sat for a moment in the particular quiet that follows a conversation that has cost something. Then she picked up the phone again and dialed a number she had not dialed in 2 years but had never forgotten. Beulah Morrow answered on the second ring. Beulah Morrow. Her voice was exactly the same. A little gravel in it from the years before she had quit smoking, a directness in the syllables that had nothing to do with impatience and everything to do with efficiency. They had met at an industry conference in Chicago in 1988, two women in a profession that was still explaining to itself whether women belonged in it, and they had recognized each other immediately as the kind of people who simply did the work, regardless of whether the room was ready for them. Beulah, it's Marv Fairweather. A beat of real warmth, the kind that travels through telephone lines. Marvell, Lord, how long has it been? How is Savannah treating you? Savannah is fine, Marv said. I'm not. I need your help, and I need you to put on your official hat when I ask. The warmth in Beulah's voice sharpened into something more focused. Tell me, Marv told her. She laid it out the same way she had described it to DeWitt, but with more precision, because Beulah would understand the precision, and because precision was the point. The 17 bookings, the single wholesaler, the corporate card, the IP address, Eugenia's flight that morning, which meant she was likely checking into the Mariposa Grand around now, accepting the complimentary champagne standing in the presidential suite looking out at the Caribbean. When she finished, there was a silence on Beulah's end that had the quality of someone doing rapid mental work. Marv, she said finally, and her voice had the particular gravity of a person choosing their next words for their structural integrity, rather than their comfort. I'm so sorry. Don't be sorry, Marv said. Be useful. A short sound that was almost a laugh. That is the Marvell Fairweather I remember. All right, let me tell you what I think is happening, and then I'm going to tell you your options. What Beulah explained in the precise and economical language of someone who had spent 20 years in fraud investigation was this: the booking was not simply an unauthorized charge. It was the first half of a two-part scheme. Eugenia had run the trip on Marv's credentials deliberately because professional travel credentials shift liability to suppliers when a chargeback is filed. The plan was to let the trip run its full 10 nights, then contact American Express posing as Marv or persuading Marv to make the call and report the charges as fraudulent. The suppliers, the airline, the hotel, the wholesaler would bear the cost. The credit card company would be made whole. And because Eugenia's name did not appear on the primary booking, appearing only as Ambrose Garrett and guest in the guest field, she would have deniability. It's a clean burn, Beulah said. Sophisticated, almost. Almost, Marv said. She made two mistakes. She used her home IP address, which any investigator will trace in under an hour. And she ran everything through one wholesaler. One conversation, one record, one way to establish the full picture before anyone has a chance to rewrite it. Marv looked at her notepad where she had written Drummond Luxury Travel Group Montreal in her precise, still clear handwriting. What are my options, she said. Beulah gave her three. The first was to do nothing. Let the trip run, allow Eugenia to file the chargeback, and accept the outcome as the cost of preserving a relationship that had already been fundamentally altered. The second was to call American Express, immediately report the fraud, and trigger a cancellation that would reach Eugenia mid-stay. Effective clean from a financial standpoint, and likely to result in legal consequences that would follow her daughter for years. The third option, Beulah said, dropping her voice into the register she used when she meant something entirely, was the option that required Marv to use what she actually had, which was not anger and was not legal leverage, but was 3 decades of reputation in an industry that was smaller than anyone outside it understood. You go to the wholesaler, Beulah said. You control the narrative before she does. You have the evidence. And Marv, your name still means something in this business. People remember who you were. Marv was quiet for a moment. I'm retired, Beulah. Your name isn't. Outside her office window, the October light was shifting toward the amber of late afternoon. The azaleas along the garden path were going brown at the edges. She looked at the computer screen, at the glowing list of luxuries being enjoyed under her name by her daughter, who had sat in her living room and looked at her with those practiced wide eyes and told her the resort was just for couples. Something clarified inside her, not anger. Something colder and more useful. Then Beulah said, and Marv could almost hear her leaning forward, you decide how you want this to end, phone call or face-to-face. She already knew the answer to that. She had known it since she unfolded the itinerary in the lounge. I need to make one more call, Marv said, and then I'll be in touch. I'll be here, Beulah said. And Marv, be careful, not with her, with yourself. Marv ended the call and sat alone in the dimming room. On the computer screen, 17 reservations glowed under her name, a catalog of someone else's idea of a perfect life purchased with someone else's identity. Through the window, the last of the afternoon light was pulling away from the garden. She had one more call to make, and then for the first time in 4 years, she was going to need her passport. 15 minutes after she ended the call with Beulah, Marv's phone buzzed once on the desk. A text message from DeWitt. She picked it up and read it, standing the screen's light cold in the dimming room. Mama, 2 months ago, Eugenia asked me whether your dormant corporate accounts could be accessed remotely. She said she was asking for a travel industry article she was writing. I told her I didn't know the technical details, but that those accounts stayed active unless the holder closed them manually. I didn't understand why she was asking. I do now. I'm sorry, I should have told you. Marv set the phone face down on the desk. She had expected the apology. What she had not expected was the specific shape of the information inside it. Remotely. Eugenia had asked about remote access. Not about the accounts in general, not about closing them or transferring them, but about whether the credentials could be used from somewhere other than this house. That single word buried in DeWitt's message like a splinter in wood told her that her daughter had not stumbled into this. She had researched it. She had identified the mechanism, confirmed its viability, and then driven down to Savannah 3 weeks later to assess whether her mother was paying close enough attention to notice. The visit with the iced tea and the cast iron skillet and the wide eyes had not been a visit. It had been reconnaissance. Marv stood very still for a moment, her hand resting on the back of her office chair. Then she sat down, turned back to the computer, and picked up the phone to call Montreal. She had found the number for Drummond Luxury Travel Group in her old Rolodex, a thing made of actual cardstock, in a rotating plastic holder that her youngest colleague at the firm had once photographed as a kind of anthropological artifact. She had never thrown it away. There were numbers in it she had not dialed in 15 years, but she had always known where it was, and she had always understood, on some professional instinct, she could not have fully articulated that the old ways of keeping information had a durability that cloud storage did not. The line rang twice, a bilingual greeting, crisp and composed. She asked for Stratton Drummond. She expected it to be transferred to an assistant. She expected to leave a message to wait to conduct this conversation tomorrow or the day after with her patience intact and her evidence organized. She had drafted the opening sentence in her mind 3 times over. What happened instead was that after a single hold period of less than 90 seconds, a man's voice came on the line. Rich, slightly accented with the particular music of someone who had grown up speaking 2 languages and had never fully chosen between them. Mrs. Fairweather, this is Stratton Drummond. It has been a long time. I was sorry to hear about your retirement. The industry lost one of its best. The immediacy of his recognition, the fact that he had taken the call himself and known her name before she had reintroduced herself, produced a sensation Marv had not felt in years. Not vanity, something more structural. The knowledge that the thing she had spent 34 years building had not simply dissolved when she stopped going to the office. It had weight, it had persistence. It was still there. Mr. Drummond, she said, keeping her voice level, thank you for taking my call directly. I'm calling about a booking made under my agent number in the past 30 days. Confirmation prefix 74 Alpha. The sound of a keyboard. Yes, the Mariposa Grand, 10 nights presidential suite. A beautiful booking. One of my senior agents handled the account personally. A brief warm pause. I hope you're enjoying the Riviera Maya, Mrs. Fairweather. You've more than earned it. The muscles along Marv's jaw tightened. He thought she was there. He thought she was the one in the suite, the one accepting the champagne, the one whose name was on the reservation because she had put it there herself. Mr. Drummond, she said, and she chose each word the way a surgeon chooses each incision for what it would accomplish, rather than how it would feel. I am sitting in my home office in Savannah, Georgia. I am not in Mexico. I have not been to Mexico. And the reason I am calling you instead of my credit card company is that I believe you and I can resolve the situation in a way that protects both of us, but only if we speak honestly and quickly. The hold music, which had never really left, dropped away entirely. The line had the quality of absolute attention. Compromised, he said, and the word came out slowly as though he was tasting it for what it implied. Mrs. Fairweather, that booking was made with your credentials confirmed through your professional email address and charged to the corporate card on your file. The verification trail is complete. I understand that. I'm not disputing the charge, and I want to be very clear about that before we go any further. I am not calling American Express. I am not filing a chargeback. I am not going to the credit card company at all. This is a conversation between 2 professionals about a serious problem, and I need your help to address it properly. Another silence different in texture from the first. This one had the quality of a man recalculating. "Tell me what you believe happened," he said. "A family member used my credentials without my authorization. A family member who understood enough about how professional travel booking systems work to exploit the gaps I left by not closing down my dormant accounts after retirement." She stopped. The admission sat in her mouth like something metallic. It was not a random theft. It was specific and it was planned, and the person who did it understood that using my professional credentials would complicate any fraud claim I might make because the verification trail, as you just noted, looks legitimate from the outside. Drummond was quiet for a moment. She could hear his breathing slow and deliberate, the breathing of a man who had been in business long enough to have heard things he did not expect. "Marvel," he said, dropping the formal address in a way that felt less like familiarity and more like respect. "You have always been a straight shooter. What do you need from me?" "I need to know the booking history, everything after the initial reservation. Any calls, any modifications, any special requests made by telephone. I can see the original confirmation on my end, but I cannot see the service logs from your side." A longer pause, more typing slower this time, the deliberate pace of someone pulling up records rather than navigating a familiar system. She waited. She had learned very early in her career that patience in a negotiation was not passivity. It was pressure applied in the quietest possible way. "There was a call," Drummond said finally. "4 days ago, a young woman, she identified herself as your new personal assistant, said you had recently come out of retirement to consult on a few high-value accounts, and that you had authorized her to handle the logistics on this particular booking." Another beat. She had your IATA number. She had the full confirmation sequence. She knew the name of the agent who handled the original reservation. Marv's hand was flat on the desk. She pressed it there deliberately the way you press a wound. "What changes did she make?" "She upgraded the spa package to the premium couples retreat. She added the private yacht excursion, a full-day charter with a private chef. She also requested that the Shreddy's welcome amenity be upgraded from standard champagne to a particular vintage, a Blanc de Blanc she specified by name." He paused. "She knew her wine." Of course she did. Eugenia had always known her wine. She had learned it in the way she had learned everything expensive, with the focused attention of someone building an identity out of taste. "Did she give a name?" Marv asked. More typing. A brief consultation with what sounded like a physical document, the rustle of paper. "Her name was Eugenia," Drummond said, and his voice had lost its warmth, entirely replaced by the flat precision of a man who understood now the full shape of what he was looking at. "No last name in the notes, just Eugenia." Marv did not move. She looked at the wall above her computer, at the small framed photograph of Bogart that she had moved from the living room to this office because here it felt less like a memorial and more like company. He was laughing in the photograph, his head turned slightly away from the camera, caught in the middle of something he had found genuinely funny. She looked at his face for the length of 3 breaths. Her daughter had given her own first name. Not a false identity, not an alias, but her actual name, which meant one of two things: either she had been careless, in which case she was less sophisticated than the plan suggested, or she had done it deliberately with the confidence of someone who was certain they would never be caught, in which case she had been counting on Marv's ignorance, with a certainty so complete it had not even occurred to her to hide. Marv believed it was the second. "Mr. Drummond," she said, and her voice had settled into the register she had used on her most difficult days, the voice that had talked down panicked executives and negotiated with the airlines during strikes and persuaded hotel managers to find rooms that did not technically exist. "That young woman was not my assistant. I am retired. I do not have an assistant. I have not consulted for any agency, and I have not authorized any calls on my behalf." A silence that had the quality of a door swinging open. "I see," he said. "I need a signed statement from the agent who took that call. A notarized statement, if possible, but a signed and witnessed email will be sufficient as a first step. I need it to record the date of the call, the specific request made, and the name the caller provided. In exchange, I am offering you something valuable. I am offering you a resolution that does not involve the credit card companies, does not involve the banking system, and does not involve the authorities. You have $52,000 of liability sitting in your presidential suite at this moment. I am offering you a clean exit. Drummond was silent for long enough that Marv counted the seconds without meaning to. 7, 8, 9, sorry, come on. You will have it within the hour, he said. What are you going to do, Marvell? She looked at the computer screen one last time. At the 17 reservations. At the charges for the yacht, in the tasting menu, in the vintage champagne, in the private photography session, all of it assembled under her name with the meticulous care of someone who had wanted very badly to live a particular kind of life and had decided that the fastest route to it ran directly through her mother. I'm going to take a trip, she said. It seems I have a reservation. She ended the call and sat for a moment in the particular silence that follows a decision that cannot be undone. Then she opened a browser window and booked a one-way ticket to Cancun, departing the following morning at 7:15. She paid with her personal credit card. The round-trip option was available for the same price, and she chose one way anyway because she did not yet know how long she would need, and because something in her refused the easy assumption of return. She packed a small overnight bag with the efficiency of someone who had been packing bags for 34 years and had long since reduced the task to its essential elements. A linen dress, 2 changes of clothes, her good sandals, her passport, which she retrieved from the fireproof document box in the closet where she kept the things that mattered. Toiletries, her old laminated IATA badge, which had lived in the document box since her retirement party, and which she had never thrown away for reasons she had never fully examined. She printed 3 copies of the Drummond statement when it arrived 53 minutes after the call ended, a scanned PDF of a formal document signed by the agent who had taken Eugenia's call and notarized by a Montreal notary whose seal was crisp and official. She read it once to verify its contents, then folded one copy into a manila envelope alongside the printed itinerary she had carried home from the airport lounge. One copy went to Beulah. One copy went into the envelope. The third she placed in the fireproof box. She set the envelope on the kitchen table and looked at it. She did not sleep that night. She sat on the screened porch as the October evening settled into full dark around her, the jasmine along the garden wall releasing its night scent, the familiar sounds of the neighborhood cycling through their familiar sequence. A car door, a dog, the distant conversation of a television through a neighbor's window. She sat with a glass of water she never drank, and she thought about her daughter. Not the woman who had called the cast iron skillet problematic, or the woman who had talked about Riviera Maya resorts with the careful casualness of someone delivering a prepared speech. She thought about a different Eugenia, the one who had stood at the back door on winter mornings waiting for the school bus with her coat buttoned wrong, and one mitten on and one mitten in her pocket, utterly unaware of how cold she was because she was thinking about something else entirely. The one who had sat at this same porch table doing homework on long summer evenings, her pencil moving steadily, her brow slightly furrowed, looking so much like Bogart in those moments that Marv had sometimes had to look away. The one she had dropped off at Spelman College on a September morning 18 years ago, who had hugged her in the parking lot with a fierceness that surprised them both, who had pulled back with her eyes bright and said, "I'm going to make you proud, Mama." She had made Marv proud, in ways that were real and for years at a time. That was the thing that made this particular night so much harder than simple anger would have made it. Anger was clean. This was not anger. She thought about what Bogart would have said, not the comforting version of him, the version her grief sometimes manufactured late at night, but the actual man with his directness and his low tolerance for self-deception. He would have said something brief. He would have said it once, and it would have contained the whole of what needed to be understood. What came to her sitting in the dark with the shaman and the distant television was his principle, the one he had given her over a fraud case and that she had applied to her work ever since. Evidence does the talking, not hope. She had the evidence. She knew what it said. The only remaining question was what she intended to do with it now that she was standing at the edge of the answer. At 4 in the morning, when the sky had begun its slow shift from black toward the deep gray that precedes dawn, she stood up and went inside. She walked to the kitchen. She took the cast iron skillet from the cabinet where it lived and set it on the burner. She made herself a simple meal rice, cooked soft with a little butter and salt, the kind of thing her own mother had made for her when she was sick or frightened or simply in need of something that asked nothing of her. She ate it standing at the counter, alone in the full quiet of a house that was hers and no one else's. It was not a ritual. She was not a woman who trafficked in rituals. It was simply breakfast made at 4 in the morning, in her own kitchen, with her own equipment, and the small, deliberate ordinariness of it was itself the point. She was still here. She was still the person who lived in this house and cooked in this kitchen and knew every creak and shadow of it. No one had taken that. No one could. She washed the pan and put it away. She picked up the manila envelope from the kitchen table, checked that everything was in order, and placed it in her overnight bag. She looked around the kitchen once, then the hallway, then the living room, the way you look at familiar rooms when you are about to leave them for a destination you cannot fully predict. The grandfather clock showed 5:40. Outside, the first birds were beginning. Through the front window, she could see the oak trees emerging from the dark as the sky gradually conceded to morning, their shapes familiar and enormous, and entirely indifferent to the specifics of what was about to happen. She picked up her bag. She took one last look at the framed photograph of Bogart, which she could see from the hallway through the open office door. His face caught mid-laugh, turned slightly away from the camera, unbothered by being looked at because he was not looking back. "All right," she said to him quietly. "Let's see if this old woman still knows how to work." She turned off the kitchen light and walked out to her car. The morning air was cool and smelled of the garden and of something she could not name, the particular scent of a day that has not yet decided what it will be. She drove toward the highway and then toward the airport, and the sky ahead of her was beginning very slowly to go the color of a pale rose, and she drove into it without looking back. What waited at the other end of the flight was her daughter, who had spent 10 years building a life that looked perfect from the outside and the last 6 months dismantling her mother's in order to fund it. What waited was a presidential suite with a champagne bucket and a view of the Caribbean and a key card that had been activated on a stolen identity. What waited was the end of something that had once been the most important thing in her life. She had the envelope on the seat beside her. She had 34 years of knowing exactly how these things worked. And she had, for the first time since Bogart died, a very clear sense of purpose, which felt in the early light of that Georgia morning almost indistinguishable from peace. The flight to Cancun took 3 hours and 40 minutes, and Marv spent most of it looking out the window at nothing in particular. The man in the seat beside her was reading the Wall Street Journal folded into quarters, the way people who had been reading print newspapers since before the internet fold them with the practiced economy of long habit. He did not speak to her, and she did not speak to him, and the silence between them was the comfortable silence of two people who understood that not every proximity requires conversation. Somewhere over the Gulf of Mexico, he looked out his window and said quietly, "Beautiful." Marv looked past him at the water far below, the particular shade of blue that exists only over shallow tropical sea, lit from beneath as much as above. "Yes," she said, "that was all. It was enough." She opened her bag once during the flight and checked the manila envelope. 3 documents folded flat corners precise. She had checked it the night before, and again that morning before leaving the house, but she checked it now because the checking was not really about the documents. It was about the ritual of preparation, the physical confirmation that she had done everything she could do from a distance, and that what remained now could only be done in person. She thought about what Beulah had said on the phone. "You decide how you want this to end, phone call or face-to-face." She had made her choice without deliberating because the answer had been clear from the moment she first understood what she was looking at. A phone call would end the financial transaction. Only a face-to-face would end the pretense. And the pretense, she had come to understand somewhere in the long dark hours of the previous night, was the thing that had done the most damage. Not the money. The pretense. The fact that Eugenia had looked at her and decided she would not notice. Not that she might not notice, or that there was a reasonable chance she would be too distracted to look closely, but that she would not notice because she was no longer a person who noticed things. A grieving widow on a front porch with an old record player. A woman whose world had shrunk to the size of a kitchen and a garden. Someone to be managed, not reckoned with. That was the thing that had kept Marv awake until 4 in the morning. Not the betrayal of the money, though $52,000 was a sum that would have mattered to her at any point in her life. It was the specific quality of the contempt embedded in the plan. The confidence of it, the way Eugenia had sat across from her in the living room and manufactured a reason for exclusion, so casually, so practiced, that the lie itself was almost an afterthought. The real message was underneath it. You are not here anymore, Mama. Not really. You are furniture in your own life. The plane began its descent. Below the Yucatan coastline appeared a thin white edge of beach between the green of the jungle and the impossible blue of the Caribbean, and Marv watched it come closer and thought about none of this anymore. She had done her thinking. She was finished with thinking. At the Cancun airport, she walked past the private transfer bay, where a driver in a white uniform was holding a sign with her name on it printed in clean black letters. Marvel Fairweather. She walked past him without pausing and took a local taxi from the municipal rank, a slightly battered Nissan with a Pine Air freshener and a radio playing something with brass and percussion that she could feel in her sternum. The driver asked her in careful English where she was going. She gave him the name of the resort. He nodded without the reaction most people had to that name, which told her he drove this route often enough that the luxury had become ordinary. They talked a little in the way strangers sometimes talk when neither of them has anything to prove. He had 3 grandchildren. She told him she had 2 adult children. He said children were blessings and headaches in equal measure and laughed at his own observation, and she laughed with him because it was true and because the laugh cost her nothing. The gates of the Mariposa Grand opened onto a long drive lined with royal palms, standing at attention in the afternoon heat, their fronds barely moving. The main building was whitewashed stucco with a terracotta roof that had the saturated warmth of something baked rather than painted, and the grounds spread away from it in every direction in a disciplined perfection of green. Marv paid the driver, thanked him, and stood for a moment in the drive with her overnight bag and her manila envelope before walking through the main entrance. The lobby was an atrium open to the sky at its center, and the light fell through it in a column that shifted the color of the stone floor from beige to pale gold. A waterfall ran down one wall into a shallow pool where orange and white koi moved with the unhurried confidence of creatures that had never been hungry. The air was cool and smelled of cut lilies arranged in tall vases along the check-in counter, and underneath the lilies very faintly, the salt and mineral smell of the sea coming in through the open sides of the structure. Celestine Fairfax was standing at the far end of the check-in counter, reviewing something on a clipboard when Marv walked in. She was a trim woman in her mid-40s, wearing the resort's manager uniform, with the ease of someone who had long since stopped thinking about it, and she had the particular alertness of someone whose job required her to read a room before the room read her. She looked up at Marv with the automatic professional assessment she probably applied to every person who walked through those doors, and Marv saw the moment the assessment arrived at a conclusion. Not a guest, something else. But Marv was not looking at Celestine Fairfax. She was looking at the far end of the lobby, where 2 people stood at the check-in counter in the process of completing their arrival. Eugenia had her head thrown back in laughter at something Ambrose had said, her hand resting on his forearm, with the practiced ease of a woman who had spent years curating how she looked in public spaces. She was wearing a white linen dress, and her hair was down, and she looked in that moment like a photograph in a travel magazine, like the kind of happiness that exists specifically to be documented. Ambrose stood beside her with the particular posture of a man who was pleased with himself, pleased with the situation, pleased with the evidence of his own ability to provide something worth being happy about. They were the picture of a life without consequences, a life where the bill had not yet arrived. Marv walked toward them. The sound of her footsteps on the marble floor was the only sound she was aware of. The lobby noise, the water, the ambient murmur of the resort, all of it receded. She kept her pace even and her eyes on the check-in counter, and she did not look at Eugenia directly, not yet, which meant she was 3 steps away before Eugenia's peripheral vision caught the movement and her head turned. The laughter stopped so completely and so suddenly that Ambrose noticed before he understood why. He turned to follow Eugenia's gaze, and his expression passed through pleased to confused to something that had not yet found its name. Eugenia's face had gone the color of old paper. Mama. The word came out in a register Marv had not heard from her in decades, thin and constricted, the voice of a child who has been found out. What are you doing here? Marv did not answer. She did not look at her daughter. She walked the remaining distance to the check-in counter where Celestine Fairfax had set down her clipboard and was watching with the focused stillness of a professional who has identified a situation requiring her full attention. Good afternoon, Marv said. I believe you're the manager on duty. I am, Celestine said. Celestine Fairfax, is there something I can help you with? I believe there is. Marv set her overnight bag on the floor beside her feet and placed the manila envelope on the counter. My name is Marvell Fairweather. I am an IATA accredited travel professional with 34 years in the industry. She reached into the envelope and placed her old laminated IATA badge on the counter. It was the original, issued in 1989, laminated again in 2003, and still carrying her professional number in the clean sans serif font that the association had used throughout her career. Celestine looked at it carefully, the way someone looks at a document when they understand that its presence means something. Eugenia came to Marv's side and put her hand on her arm, her grip surprisingly firm. Mama, let's go upstairs. We can talk about this privately. Whatever is happening, we can sort it out. Marv removed her daughter's hand from her arm. She did it gently, without drama, the way you move an obstacle that has placed itself in front of you without malice. Then she looked at Eugenia for the first time since she had walked into the lobby. Eugenia's eyes were wide, not the manufactured wideness of the living room 3 weeks ago, not the performed earnestness of the porcelain bird story. This was something unmanaged and raw, the expression of a person watching the ground they are standing on shift beneath them and not yet knowing how far it will move. There is nothing to discuss privately, Eugenia, Marv said. She turned back to the counter and placed the printed itinerary beside the badge. The presidential suite currently occupied by Mr. and Mrs. Ambrose Garrett was booked using my agent number and my corporate credit card. It was booked without my knowledge and without my authorization. Ambrose had moved to stand a few feet behind Eugenia. He was listening with the focused attention of a man whose professional training had taught him to understand the legal weight of words as they were being spoken, and his face showed the progression of that understanding in real time. Marv took the notarized statement from the envelope and placed it on the counter beside the other two documents. This is a sworn statement from Drummond Luxury Travel Group, the wholesaler through whom all 17 reservations were made. It documents a telephone call placed 4 days ago by a woman who identified herself as my personal assistant using my IATA number and full booking credentials to add services to this reservation. The woman gave her name as Eugenia. Marv's voice did not waver. I do not have a personal assistant. I am retired. 3 documents on the counter. Badge, itinerary, statement. A straight, unbroken line of documented truth. Celestine Fairfax picked up each document in turn and read it with the thoroughness of someone who understood that what she did in the next 60 seconds would matter. The lobby had acquired the particular quality of silence that happens when everyone present understands that something irreversible is occurring. The waterfall continued its indifferent descent. The koi moved in their slow circles. Eugenia made one more attempt. Marv would acknowledge later that it took a particular kind of nerve, and that nerve had always been one of her daughter's qualities, for better and for worse. Mama. Her voice had found a new register, lower, more controlled, the voice she used in her videos when she was discussing something she wanted her audience to feel she was confiding. I know how this looks. I know you're upset, but you don't understand what's been happening. Ambrose and I have been going through things you don't know about, and I just needed one thing to go right. One thing that felt like our life was still intact, and I didn't think you would miss it. I didn't think it would matter to you the way it matters to us, and I know that was wrong. I know it, but if you could just let me explain privately, just give me that chance. Marv listened to all of it. She did not interrupt. She let her daughter finish, let the words find their shape and settle into the air between them. Then she was quiet for a moment before she spoke. Eugenia, I read the IP address on the booking. I have a sworn statement with your first name on it. I drove your neighbor Mamie to the airport and ended up in a lounge where a concierge told me that someone had called that morning to find out whether I had looked at my reservations yet. She paused. You were not protecting your marriage. You were running a scheme, and you built it on the assumption that I had become someone who could be used without consequence. That assumption was the mistake. Eugenia stood very still. Ambrose took one step backward. It was a small movement, barely perceptible, and he did not appear to do it consciously. But the step took him out of alignment with his wife, placed him at a distance that was not yet separation, but was no longer the unified front of a couple. Marv saw it. Celestine Fairfax saw it. Eugenia, whose eyes were fixed on her mother, did not see it, which was perhaps its own kind of mercy. Celestine set the documents down on the counter with the care of someone handling things that had become evidence. Mrs. Garrett, she said, her voice perfectly modulated, carrying neither judgment nor sympathy, only the clean authority of her position. I'll need a credit card to cover the balance on this reservation. The full amount of $52,400 plus applicable taxes and any incidentals transferred to a new form of payment before we can complete your check-in. The sound that came from Eugenia was not a word. It was something that began as a protest and collapsed before it could find its form. Ambrose looked at his wife. His expression had arrived at a place beyond confusion, past the moment of processing, into the stillness of a man who has understood something he cannot unlearn. He stared at her for a long moment with an intensity that had nothing to do with anger, which would have been easier, and everything to do with the specific devastation of recognizing a stranger in a familiar face. Eugenia, he said, just her name, nothing more. But the way he said it contained a question he was already answering for himself. She turned to him, and whatever she saw in his face, she looked away again, quickly back toward her mother, her last remaining audience. Mama, please. The performance had left her voice entirely now. What remained was something younger and more frightened than anything Marv had heard from her daughter in many years. Please don't do this. Marv looked at her daughter for a long moment. She looked at her the way you look at something you have known for a long time and are seeing clearly for the first time, which is both more and less than you expected always, and which carries its own particular grief. I'm not doing anything to you, Eugenia, she said quietly. I'm simply here. She turned to Celestine Fairfax. I won't be requiring accommodations. I have a return flight this evening. She picked up her IATA badge from the counter and placed it back in the envelope. Thank you for your professionalism. Celestine met her eyes. Thank you for yours, Mrs. Fairweather. She said it simply without elaboration, but with a directness that conveyed considerably more. Marv picked up her bag and walked out of the lobby. The heat outside after the cool of the atrium was immediate and total. The kind of heat that has weight and presence that presses against you from every angle at once. She stood for a moment in it and breathed. The air smelled of salt and the diesel of the resort vehicles, and something green and tropical she could not name. A gecko moved across the whitewashed wall beside the entrance with effortless speed and then stopped motionless as though it had never moved at all. She found a taxi at the resort's service entrance and told the driver to take her back to the Cancun airport. She sat in the back and looked out at the road unwinding ahead of them, the jungle pressing close on both sides, vivid and indifferent, and she took out her phone and dialed Beulah Morrow. Beulah picked up on the first ring. It's done, Marv said, a silence that felt like relief rather than surprise. How are you? I'm all right, she considered. I'm better than I expected to be. Good, Beulah said. That's what I wanted to hear. Another pause, warm and brief. You did it right, Marv. I don't know if there is a right way to do this. There's a wrong way. You didn't do that. Beulah's voice was quiet. Get home safe. Marv put the phone away and looked back out the window. The Gulf was visible briefly through a gap in the tree line, a flash of blue so intense it seemed almost fictional, and then the jungle closed again, and there was only the road. She did not cry on the flight home. She had thought she might in the privacy of the aircraft cabin, but what came instead was not grief in the way she had expected it, not the sharp-edged, specific pain of an acute wound. It was something more diffuse and more permanent, the understanding that a particular version of her life had ended, a version that had contained a daughter who was the person Marv had believed her to be. That version was gone. What replaced it was real and incomplete and would require time she did not yet know how to imagine. But she was still here. The house on Magnolia Avenue was still there. The garden was still there. The cast iron skillet was in the cabinet, and Bogart's photograph was on the desk, and the Rolodex with 30 years of names and numbers sat on the shelf, slightly ridiculous and entirely irreplaceable. She was still here. The months that followed were quieter than she had anticipated, and in the quietness, there was something she had not expected, which was space. Space to hear the things she had not been hearing. The sound of her own house at different hours. The particular quality of light on her garden at 7 in the morning. The pleasure of a meal cooked only to her own taste without anyone suggesting the oil was wrong or the pan was problematic. Beulah helped her close the corporate accounts, formally secured the IATA credentials, and filed the fraud documentation with the association's oversight office. It was handled quietly, as these things are when they are handled by people who understand the system, but it was handled completely, and there was a record now in a file somewhere that would follow Eugenia if she ever attempted to enter the industry through legitimate channels. DeWitt flew down to Savannah 3 weeks after she returned unannounced, arriving on a Sunday morning with a box of biscuits from the coffee place they had been going to since he was a teenager, the one on the corner that still made them by hand and still charged what they had charged in 1998. He stood at the door and looked at her and said, "I'm sorry, Mama, for not believing you immediately and for giving her the information she needed. I should have asked more questions." Marv looked at her son, this man who had her husband's forehead and her own stubbornness, and had been trying imperfectly to do the right thing his whole life, and she stood aside to let him in. It was not the full restoration of something. It was the beginning of a different arrangement, more honest and more careful, and she thought she could live with that. Through the family network that operates in every extended family, whether anyone officially maintains it, she heard that Ambrose Garrett had filed for divorce. She had expected this. What she had not expected was the information that came with it filtered through DeWitt, who had been in contact with Ambrose's attorney on an unrelated matter. Ambrose, in the course of the divorce proceedings, had learned things about his wife's financial history that he had not known during their marriage. Tax obligations that had been accumulating for several years. Business obligations connected to a consulting venture Eugenia had operated briefly. The $52,000 was not the whole of it. It was the visible surface. Marv sat with that for a long time. She did not feel vindicated by it. She felt tired and sad in the way that you feel sad when a fear you had been suppressing for years turns out to have been accurate. It was DeWitt who told her something else later, over a phone call in November. He had spoken with Ambrose at length, and Ambrose had shared something Eugenia had said to him during one of their final arguments before the marriage collapsed entirely. She had told him that she had never intended for any of it to hurt Marv, that in some part of herself that she could not entirely articulate, she had wanted her mother to find out. She had built it in a way that could be found, used her own name, used a single supplier, left the IP address on a portal her mother still had access to. She had not been trying to get away clean. She had been trying to be seen. Marv was quiet for a long time after DeWitt told her that. She was on the porch when he called the November evening, coming down cool and early, now the jasmine finished for the season. She sat with the phone in her hand after they said goodbye and looked at the garden going gray in the fading light. She thought about a small girl with her coat button wrong standing at the back door waiting to be noticed. She thought about all the ways a person can ask for something without being able to say what it is, and all the ways the people who love them can fail to hear the question underneath the question. She did not know whether that understanding changed anything. It did not undo what had been done. It did not rebuild what had been taken down. But it added a dimension to the story that made it harder to summarize neatly, and she thought that was probably accurate because the important stories always were. On a Saturday in late November, she held a cousin's reunion on the front porch. The Gulf Coast branch of her mother's family people she had been drifting from for years under the pressure of work and grief, and the simple attrition of distance came from 4 states. They brought food and their various children in their accumulated years, in the specific ease of people who have known each other long enough to have run out of the need to perform. The porch was full of voices and the smell of grilled oysters and her crawfish etouffee that someone had specifically requested, and Al Green came through the speakers from inside and mixed with the evening air. Her cousin Bertie sat beside her toward the end of the afternoon and took her hand without saying anything, first the way people do when the words are beside the point. Then she said, "You look like yourself again. Marv, for a while there you were carrying something that didn't belong to you." Marv looked at the people on her porch, the faces she had known since before she had known anything, the evidence of a life that was larger and more various than any single part of it, even the hardest parts. "The weight is gone, Bertie," she said. She meant it as a simple statement of fact, and it was. Rochelle called in December. She had found Marv's number through Bertie's daughter, a coincidence of connections that seemed too neat to be accidental, but that Marv accepted as the kind of thing that happens when the world is smaller than it appears. Rochelle told her that she had applied for a position with a hospitality fraud investigation firm, the kind of work that existed at the intersection of the industry she knew and the instincts she had been developing for years. She had been accepted. "I want you to know," Rochelle said, "that you're the reason I applied. What I saw that day in the lounge and then what I heard afterward, it clarified something for me about what the work is actually for. Marv thought about a young woman behind a granite counter placing a document with both hands in front of a stranger she had just met, trusting her own instinct in the face of uncertainty. You made the right call, Marv said. From the beginning. That was all you. After the holiday season passed, the house settled into a new version of its usual quiet. Not the silence of absence, not the silence of waiting. Something more settled. She worked in the garden most mornings. She read in the afternoons. She called DeWitt on Sundays and they talked about ordinary things. His work, her garden, a documentary she had watched, a case he could not discuss in detail. The conversations had a different quality, now more honest in their limitations, more grateful for what they were. She did not hear from Eugenia. She did not know and made a deliberate choice not to find out where Eugenia was or how she was managing. The divorce was proceeding. The financial complications were being addressed by people whose job it was to address them. Her daughter was somewhere in the world navigating the consequences of her own choices with whatever resources she had left, and Marv found that she could hold both things at once, the love that had not gone away, which she suspected never entirely would, and the clear-eyed understanding that her daughter's journey was no longer hers to plan or manage or protect. She had spent 34 years in the business of getting people from where they were to where they wanted to be. She had done it with precision and care and a respect for the complexity of routes that did not always go in straight lines. She had also spent 34 years understanding that you could plan the perfect itinerary and still have someone choose a different destination at the last moment, that you could book the best available option and still have someone miss the flight. What she had learned in the quiet of her office in front of a glowing computer screen on an October afternoon was the thing that no itinerary can fully account for, which was this: some of the most important journeys are the ones you take not towards something, but away from a version of yourself that has been waiting patient and unremarked to be left behind. She had been the woman on the front porch with the old record player. She had been the widow who did not open her laptop. She had been the mother who would not notice. She was also the woman who had read an IP address like a fingerprint, called in a debt of professional trust, 3 decades old, flown a one-way ticket to a resort on another country's coast, and walked across a marble lobby with a manila envelope and 34 years of knowing exactly what she was doing. Both of these women were true. She had room for both of them now. On a January evening when the new year had just begun to feel like itself, she sat alone on the porch with a glass of iced tea sweating in the cool night air, which was exactly cold enough to make the cold drink a small act of stubbornness. And she looked up at a sky that was doing its best with what the light pollution left it. She thought of Eugenia somewhere out there, and the thought was not without pain, but it was without the particular weight of responsibility she had been carrying for months, the sense that her daughter's choices were somehow a verdict on her own life. They were not a verdict. They were a separate story being written by someone else in a hand she recognized but could not control. Her own story was still going. That was the thing. Still going with its garden and its cousins and its cast iron skillet and its Rolodex full of names, with its grief and its clarity and its capacity, which she had discovered somewhat late, but not too late for something very close to peace. Some confirmation code, she had said to Bogart in the dark of her office, outlasts the warmth they were written to protect. She had meant it as an observation about the industry, about the cold persistence of records in a business built on human longing. But sitting on her porch in January, with the moon doing what it could, and the new year still new enough to hold possibility, she understood she had also meant something else. That what endures is not always what we expect. That the things built on truth have a durability that the things built on borrowing do not. And that a woman of 68 with good credentials and a clear record and 34 years of knowing how the systems work is not finished simply because someone who loved her decided she was. She set down her glass. The night was quiet. The garden was dark and full and entirely her own. She was still here. And that in the end was the only confirmation that it ever mattered.